Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. It's about Ukraine, but not like the usual stuff you hear about on the news. We're going deep on some allegations of corruption in their government and digging into how that might be affecting their relationship with the United States. Our source for this deep dive is an article from American Thinker. It's titled, "Trump Must Take Heed of the Corruption in Ukraine's Government." It was just published a few days ago on December 28th, 2024.
You know, what's really wild is that all this is happening while Ukraine's in the middle of a war. They're their third straight year of conflict with Russia, heavily reliant on international aid and facing a huge budget shortfall. It's kind of a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely creates a lot of pressure. I mean, you have a government that's just struggling to function, and then you add these accusations of corruption on top of that.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, how much of this alleged corruption stems directly from the war? You know, the chaos, the instability, it's going to have some impact. But let's get into the specifics. The article really focuses on this organization called the SPFU, the State Property Fund of Ukraine. Do you know much about them?
To be honest, I had no idea what the SPFU was before reading this article.
Yeah, it's not exactly a common topic of conversation.
Yeah.
But they're basically in charge of all the state-owned assets in Ukraine. They handle things like privatization, leasing of state property, all the big stuff. Think of them as the gatekeepers of Ukraine's economic resources. So when you have that much power concentrated in one place, well, you can see how it could be vulnerable to exploitation.
Oh, for sure. So wait, the SPFU reports directly to the Office of the President, right? And that's where things get even more interesting. The article talks about this former deputy at the Office of the President, Rostislav Sherma. He was basically overseeing the SPFU, and then suddenly he's dismissed amid all these corruption allegations. And the article even implies that the U.S. might have pushed for his removal.
Oh, that's a bombshell. Is the U.S. really dictating who gets to run a key part of the Ukrainian government? I mean, what does that say about their sovereignty? And this is all happening while they're in the middle of a war for survival. Talk about a pressure cooker.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. So, okay, let's assume for a minute that the U.S. did play a role in Sherma's dismissal. You'd hope they'd replace him with someone who was squeaky clean, right? But that doesn't seem to be the case. The article claims that the current Minister of Defense, Rustem Umerov, might be the one in control now.
That is where it gets really interesting. Because before becoming Minister of Defense, guess what Umerov was doing?
I don't know.
He was the head of the SP, the SPFU.
No way. So he goes from leading the SPFU, which is at the center of these corruption allegations, to becoming the Minister of Defense. While the Ukrainian military is struggling to hold back the Russian advance, it really makes you wonder where his priorities lie.
Right. It almost seems like he's more interested in consolidating power within the SPFU than he is in actually winning the war. But of course, this is just one side of the story. What do you think? Could there be another explanation for his actions?
It's tough to say without knowing more. Maybe he's trying to clean up the mess from the inside. Or maybe there are strategic considerations we're not aware of.
It's possible. But the article does lay out a pretty compelling argument. They point to specific individuals that Umerov supposedly installed in key positions within the SPFU, like Alexander Fedorishin and Denis Shaigali. They allege that he's using them to maintain control and potentially continue these corrupt practices, even from his new position as Minister of Defense.
Wow, that's a serious accusation. But what exactly are these corrupt practices? Are there any concrete examples?
Well, the article suggests that one scheme might involve undervaluing state properties and then selling them off to cronies for a profit. But, to be fair, they don't provide any hard evidence to back up these claims, at least not in this particular article.
Okay, so we're dealing with allegations, rumors, and potential power plays. It all sounds very cloak and dagger, but how does this all tie back to the U.S.?
Here's where things get really interesting. The article suggests that Umerov might be shifting alliances away from the U.S. and towards Turkey.
Really?
Yeah.
Turkey? Why Turkey?
Well, remember that the U.S. and Turkey haven't exactly been on the best of terms lately, and the article specifically mentions this new Ka-an fighter jet that Turkey and Ukraine are supposedly developing together. Could this be a sign of things to come? Is Umerov turning his back on the U.S. and cozying up to a new partner?
That's a fascinating development. And to add to that, the article mentions two other individuals, Snevir Sathalov and Lenur Mambatov. Umerov apparently brought them on as freelance advisors, and there are whispers that they have ties to Turkey as well.
It definitely seems like he's playing both sides. But let's not forget, there's another major player about to enter the picture. Donald Trump. He's taking over the White House in just a few days. And he hasn't exactly been shy about his skepticism towards U.S. involvement in Ukraine. What do you think? Do you think he'll buy into these allegations of corruption?
Knowing Trump, I doubt he'll ignore them. He's already been pretty critical of the amount of aid the U.S. is sending to Ukraine. And if he believes there's widespread corruption, he might be even less likely to keep the money flowing.
And with his America First agenda, you can bet he'll be putting pressure on Ukraine to prioritize American interests above all else. But what does that mean for Umarov and his alleged pivot towards Turkey? This whole situation feels like a ticking time bomb.
It's definitely a tangled web.
Yeah.
And it seems like the average Ukrainian citizen might just get caught in the crossfire.
That's a good point. We've been talking a lot about geopolitics and potential corruption. But at the end of the day, this is about real people living through a very real war. What do you think it's like for the average Ukrainian citizen to hear these allegations?
I can't even imagine. You're just trying to survive a brutal war, relying on your government for basic necessities, hoping they'll keep you safe. And then you hear these accusations of high-level corruption, potentially involving the very people responsible for defending your country.
It'd be a real blow, wouldn't it? You're putting your life on the line, your family's in danger, and then you start to wonder if the people in power are truly looking out for you.
Exactly. And it's not just about morale either. Think about the practical implications. Ukraine is extremely reliant on international aid to keep its economy going, to fund the war effort. What happens if those donor countries start questioning where their money is actually going?
That's a great point. The US, the EU, they're pouring billions into Ukraine. If there's even a hint of corruption, it could seriously jeopardize that support. It wouldn't just be a political issue. It would have a direct impact on people's lives.
And it's not just about the money, is it? If corruption is allowed to spread unchecked, it undermines the rule of law. It erodes trust in institutions. And it weakens the very foundation of democracy. That's a dangerous path for any country, especially one trying to rebuild after a war.
It really is. It creates this vicious cycle. Corruption breeds instability, which then makes it even harder to combat corruption effectively. It becomes this self-perpetuating problem.
So let's recap for a second. We've got these allegations of potential corruption within the SPFU. We've got Umarov allegedly pulling the strings from his new position, his apparent shift towards Turkey, and Trump's skepticism about U.S. aid looming in the background. It's a lot to take in, isn't it?
It really is. It's this whole web of interconnected issues with the potential to seriously impact the war, Ukraine's future, and even the global balance of power.
One thing that really stood out to me in the article was how the author framed it as a warning to Trump. Like they were saying, hey, watch out. This is what you're walking into.
That's a great observation. There's definitely a cautionary tone to the article. Like it's trying to raise a red flag and say, be careful who you trust. But I think it goes beyond just a warning to Trump.
I agree. I think it's also a call for greater transparency and accountability within Ukraine's government. They need to address these allegations head on, show their people and the world that they're serious about rooting out corruption.
Transparency is so important. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? But it has to be genuine, not just for show. The Ukrainian people deserve a government that's held to the highest ethical standards.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics and the power plays, but we can't forget that this is ultimately about the people of Ukraine. Their lives, their futures are at stake.
And that's why these conversations are so important, to bring these issues to light, to scrutinize those in power, and to hold them accountable.
So let's say, hypothetically, that these allegations against Umarov are true. What would that mean for Ukraine moving forward?
Well, it would depend on the extent of the corruption. If it's truly systemic, deeply rooted within the government, it could be incredibly destabilizing. It could hinder their ability to defend themselves, further erode public trust, and ultimately jeopardize their chances of rebuilding a strong and prosperous nation.
And what about the U.S.? How would this affect their involvement in the conflict? Would they pull back their support?
That's a tough question. On one hand, if the U.S. sees its aid being misused, potentially ending up in the pockets of corrupt officials, they might be less inclined to keep sending money, especially with someone like Trump in the White House, who's already expressed doubts about the level of U.S. involvement.
But on the other hand, wouldn't withdrawing support just play into Russia's hands? It would make Ukraine even more vulnerable and potentially undermine the entire Western effort to contain Russian aggression.
That's the dilemma, isn't it? It's a real balancing act. The U.S. wants to support Ukraine, but they also need to make sure their aid is being used effectively and responsibly. And if they don't have that assurance, it could have major consequences.
So what does all this mean for our listener? Why should they care about these allegations of corruption happening halfway around the world?
That's a great question. And it's something I think about a lot. In our globalized world, what happens in one corner of the planet inevitably affects us all. These allegations, if they're true, could have a real impact on global security, the balance of power, and even the future of democracy itself.
And it also makes us think about the complexities of international aid, the responsibilities of governments to use those funds wisely, and the challenges of holding those in power accountable.
It's a reminder that we can't just be passive observers. We need to be informed, engaged citizens, questioning what we hear, seeking out different perspectives, and demanding better from our leaders.
It's all about critical thinking, right? Don't just take things at face value. Dig deeper, question your assumptions, and form your own informed opinions.
Exactly. Don't just consume information. Be a critical thinker. Be a discerning analyst. And remember, this isn't just about abstract political concepts. It's about the lives of real people who are being directly affected by these decisions.
This deep dive has been really insightful. We've uncovered a lot of layers to this story, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to uncover, isn't there?
Yeah.
More questions to ask, more perspectives to consider. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's an ongoing process of discovery.
Before we wrap up this part, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the human cost of all of this. We talked about the potential political and economic consequences, but what about the impact on the Ukrainian people themselves? How are they coping with these allegations on top of everything else they're going through?
It's heartbreaking to think about. Imagine being a Ukrainian soldier fighting on the front lines, risking your life every day to defend your country, and then hearing that the people you're fighting for might be lining their own pockets.
The betrayal would be devastating. And what about the families who've lost loved ones in the war? Can you imagine the anger and resentment they must feel if they believe their sacrifices have been exploited for personal gain?
It would be a terrible blow. And it's not just about the emotional toll either. If these allegations are true, it could have a real impact on the war effort itself.
How so?
Well, think about it. If soldiers lose faith in their leaders, if they start questioning why they're being given certain orders, it could really damage morale, undermine discipline, and ultimately weaken their ability to fight effectively.
So it's like a domino effect. Corruption at the top could lead to a loss of confidence, which could impact military performance and potentially even affect the outcome of the war.
Exactly. It shows how corruption is not just a moral issue. It's a strategic threat. It can weaken a nation from the inside, making it more vulnerable to attack from the outside.
It's a sobering thought. And it raises so many more questions. How are the Ukrainian people responding to these allegations? Is there a sense of outrage, a demand for accountability? Or are they resigned to the fact that corruption is simply a part of life in their country?
Those are important questions. And unfortunately, this article doesn't really explore those aspects, but it's definitely something worth looking into further.
Maybe we could do another deep dive focused specifically on the impact on the Ukrainian people.
I'd be very interested to learn more about that.
I think our listeners would be too. This is clearly a very complex issue with far-reaching implications. It really highlights the human cost of conflict, doesn't it?
It does. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, especially when you're talking about international relations and geopolitics. But we have to remember that these decisions, these policies, they have real consequences for real people.
For sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the most important takeaway is that the situation in Ukraine is much more complicated than it seems. There's so much going on. You have the ongoing war, the dependence on foreign aid, these allegations of corruption, the shifting alliances, and then you have Trump about to take office. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're just starting to see how the pieces fit together.
And it sounds like some of those pieces might not fit so neatly. We're talking about accusations, rumors, potential power struggles, and a lot of uncertainty about the future.
Exactly. And that uncertainty is worrying, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the whole world. Because what happens in Ukraine will have consequences far beyond its borders.
That's for sure. This deep dive has definitely left me with more questions than answers. But I actually think that's a good thing. It means we're engaging with the topic, thinking critically, and trying to understand a really complex situation.
I agree. Our goal wasn't to provide all the answers, but to spark your curiosity, to encourage you to think for yourselves, and to give you the information and context you need to form your own opinions.
Speaking of information, maybe we should remind our listeners where they can find the source material for this deep dive.
Absolutely. The article we've been discussing is titled, "Trump Must Take Heed of the Corruption in Ukraine's Government." It was published in American Thinker on December 28, 2024. I highly recommend checking it out and forming your own conclusions.
We always encourage our listeners to go beyond the headlines, to dig deeper into the issues and to consider different perspectives. There's so much information out there, but it's up to each of us to be discerning, to be critical thinkers, and to be engaged citizens.
Well said. And remember, this is a developing story. Things could change at any moment. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
Absolutely. As always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. It really makes you think about the human side of things.
It does. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract when we talk about these big international issues. But we can't forget every decision, every policy, even every act of corruption. It all has a real impact on real people.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners will take away from this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the situation in Ukraine is way more complex than it might seem at first glance. There are so many different factors at play here. You have the ongoing war, the reliance on foreign aid, the accusations of corruption, the shifting alliances, and of course you have Trump coming into office soon. It's like this massive puzzle, and we're just starting to figure out how all the pieces fit together.
And it sounds like those pieces might not fit together as neatly as we'd like. We're dealing with allegations, rumors, potential power struggles, and a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds.
Exactly. And that uncertainty is a cause for concern, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the international community as a whole. Because whatever happens in Ukraine, it's going to have ripple effects that will be felt far beyond its borders.
You're absolutely right. This deep dive has definitely left me with more questions than answers. But I think that's actually a good thing. It means we're really engaging with the issue. We're thinking critically, and we're trying to make sense of a really complex situation.
I agree completely. We didn't set out to provide all the answers with this deep dive. Our goal was to spark your curiosity, to get you thinking critically, and to give you the information and context you need to form your own opinions.
And speaking of information, maybe we should remind our listeners where they can find the source material for this deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. The article we've been talking about is titled, "Trump Must Take Heed of the Corruption in Ukraine's Government." It was published in American Thinker on December 28th, 2024. I highly recommend checking it out, reading it for yourself, and coming to your own conclusions.
As always, we encourage our listeners to dig deeper, go beyond the headlines, explore different viewpoints. There's a ton of information out there, but it's up to each of us to be discerning, to think critically, and to be engaged citizens.
Well said. And one last thing to keep in mind. This is an evolving situation. Things could change at any time. So stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.